And welcome to all our viewers. Thank you so much for joining us for this panel discussion on breaking the cycle of childhood violence and trauma. I am Tahira Carter, Senior Communications Specialist at the OECS Commission, and I will be your host for this session. On today's panel, we have 5 speakers who will tackle different aspects of this complex matter, childhood violence and trauma. Presenting today, we have Hanif E.A. Benjamin, President and CEO of the Center for Human Development. We also have Shannon Miller Cox, founder of Trauma Intelligence and founder of Journey of Hope, a nonprofit for girls, women, and LGBTQIA. Sandra Wright, founder and CEO of Break the Silence Global, Inc. Dr. Shelly Abdul Zarazegi, Regional Gender Advisor for UNICEF's Latin America and the Caribbean Office, and His Royal Highness, Dr. Clyde Rivers, Acting Representative to the United Nations, New York, and for the Interfaith Peace Building Initiative and the United Nations Department of Public Information. Now, before we get started, just a few housekeeping matters. There will be a question and answer segment towards the end of this session. So we do encourage you to pose your questions in the Q&A box that you can find to the bottom of your screen. To our Francophone viewers, this session will also be live interpreted into French. So if you click the globe icon towards the bottom of your screen, you'll be able to access this service. Finally, we will be launching a brief poll towards the end of the session, and we would love it if you could just take less than a minute to share your feedback with us. Now, each presenter will have just about 10 minutes to present, and then we're going to open the floor up to questions. We don't have a lot of time. We're working with 1 hour this afternoon. So without further ado, I will now call on our first presenter, Mr. Hanif Benjamin, to speak to us about the deep-rooted effects of childhood violence and trauma within the context of child-adolescent brain development. Hanif, over to you.
Good evening, and thank you from wherever in the world you might be. It is indeed a pleasure to be with you in Trinidad and Tobago via the World Wide Web. And the topic this evening is a heavy one, and allow me a moment to delineate with you as we get into the seriousness of childhood trauma, more so violent trauma. But in the context of brain and adolescent development, something that we sometimes forget, we must understand that when we are dealing with trauma, it is not just about the event. Many of us are caught up in only the event, and unfortunately, that is where we remain, the event of the trauma. But we can move from the event of the trauma all the way to recovery. But in order to do that, we must understand what is the trauma and how it has impacted that of our children and adolescents. And so it is important for us to understand the developmental neurobiological underlying or underpinnings in our children and adolescents and what it does for them. Now, when we look at developmental trauma, especially coming out of violence, rape, and other violent incidences of trauma, we're talking about how does this impact that of brain and adolescent development? Because I suspect that we might be treating children for things they have no control over because of the trauma they would have experienced early in their years. So what exactly is the impact of developmental trauma and well-being, and what are the outcomes for our children? And interestingly enough, we must pay particular attention to how this trauma reverberates across the lifetime of that child. Because when we consider the reverberation of this trauma, we are talking about the developmental milestone across the life of this child. And so a lot of times when we are working with children who have been traumatized, especially from a violent perspective, we do not see the developmental delays. We do not see the impact of developmental trauma. What we see is a bad behaving child. And if you can allow me but just a moment to get Caribbean with you, we understand the child, the miserable child. That is what we see, the bad behaved child. we do not recognize the child who is living with a traumatic incident that has changed the trajectory of their brain development. We are not seeing a child whose brain has been altered for survival, because the only focus of the brain after traumatization is that of survival. And what we see in our children every day is survival. So their response to life, whether their response is an emotional response or a behavioral response, is linked to a traumatic reminder. Remember, I said too often we live in a traumatic incident as opposed to a traumatic recovery. So if we continue to live in that traumatic incident, the brain, the development of that brain is responding constantly to a trauma that might not be present or no longer is present. But your brain is constantly reminded of this trauma, and you are constantly protecting your mind, your body, by its natural occurrences. So for example, you are living in a fight, flight, or freeze modality for life. That is not where it's supposed to go. So when you look at the trajectory of this developmental trauma over children, we're talking about where we're going to start to have medical issues, deep mental health issues, psychological issues, because our body's constantly responding to a stimuli that is no longer present. So it is important for us to understand early childhood trauma and not just treat it, because for many of us, we're thinking about treating this trauma, but we go in and we say, yes, we have treated the trauma, but in actuality, did we in fact treat the trauma? In order to help, we must understand. And are we understanding the developmental milestone that has been curtailed because of this trauma? In order for us to do that, we must understand that trauma is like a pebble that is thrown onto a pond, and it reverberates on and on and on and on. And even if we feel that we came in and we curtailed the trauma, did we in fact facilitated healing for this child over time? And so we need to understand the relationship between lifetime trauma and behavior. Too many of us, Caribbean people, we were beaten because they thought we were bad children. But in actuality, we were responding to traumas that we did not know how to deal with. And therefore, we must pay attention to the cultural nuances as well as the behavioral manifestation in order for us to help our children deal with this developmental trauma. We must pay particular attention to the history of this trauma and how it would have impacted this child. And so trauma can linger long after the event, years after the event. That is why today we have so many adult-child trauma living among us. Too often we walk around with this trauma. And so how do we then deal with this, ladies and gentlemen? We must understand that our response to this trauma must take a macro and a micro impact. We must understand that we want to build a trauma system, and I keep making this point. Our system must be a trauma-informed system. What do I mean by a trauma-informed system? We must be able to collaborate over all services, agencies, and country. We must be able to build strength-based interaction with family, parents, peers, and experts. We must pay attention to the cultural nuances, humility, responsiveness, affirmation, and we must also understand the trauma from the child's perspective. We must understand community-based violence and how it impacts people. And we must make all our agencies accountable. Now, let me say this. We are all signatories to the UNCHR, United Nations Convention on the Right of the Child. It means then that every country, our legislative agenda must fit trauma recovery. It must protect our children, not just protect them from a traumatic incident or event, but we must protect them from re-traumatizing them over and over and over. And this comes via legislative changes, policy changes, practice changes. Once we are able to build agencies, government, and country that are trauma-informed, not only are we able to save our children when they are traumatized, but we will also save their future so that they can become productive people. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Hanif. Thank you for that. What stood out to me most in your presentation was that we need trauma-informed systems, what you were speaking about there just at the end. I mean, this really isn't something that we can deal with in isolation because the effects are so far-reaching. Thank you for that. And I really do hope that we can come back and discuss this more in the Q&A segment. I'm now going to invite Sandra Wright, who will share some personal experiences with us as it relates to childhood abuse and its effects during adulthood. Sandra, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much. Good evening, good night, because we're all over the world. My name is Sandra Wright, and I am a childhood trauma survivor. And as Hanif
We seem to be having some technical difficulties there with Sandra. So what we can do is invite Dr. Shelley to come on board and possibly start her presentation just in the interest of time. And once Sandra is sorted out, she can come back on because she
from about 2 to about the age of 8. And then when I was 10, I was raped. Back then, no one understood about trauma. No one even thought about it. I was born and raised in Jamaica. I didn't know what was going on within me. But as I got older, especially when I migrated to America, I realized that if I was triggered, now I understand the word, I would get angry. So whenever I was made to feel helpless, I had anger. So I had really bad anger issues. People would say, oh, she has a bad attitude. She has a nasty attitude. She's mean. And I would always think to myself, I'm not mean. And it wasn't until I actually went in to do my master's degree and I started studying this whole trauma thing and actually came out when I graduated with my master's and started really working with people that I realized that, wait a minute, Sandra, you developed ADHD when you were younger, because as I look back over my life, I remember that it was easy for me to lose focus. I was very good in school. I was straight A's, but I would lose focus easily. And the anger was my biggest thing. It affected relationships. And not only that was not my only trauma, because I was also physically abused as a child. Hanif talked about the Caribbean children, how we are beaten. So I got beatings for things that I never even did. And so it was from one trauma to another. And so over the years, it was compounded. And my defense was anger. When I felt as if I was placed in a situation where my control was taken from me, I was placed in a situation where I was helpless, I would resort to anger. And so I would just explode, and it was really bad. And I couldn't understand what it was that was wrong with me. I really did not realize until I was in my 40s that this was a result of the trauma that I encountered. Again, like I said, I developed ADHD. When it came to my relationships, I would, as soon as someone did something that I thought hurt me, or in my head, offended me, I would shut down, I would push them away. So this affected my relationships. And I'm talking about relationships on every level: sibling relationships, parental relationships, relationships with friends. It didn't matter who it was, as long as I felt as if I was being hurt, I was being taken advantage of, I would shut down and I would push you away. It wasn't until I got into one of my jobs and I had a supervisor, and she really triggered me. She triggered me a lot. And I realized every time she would volunteer me to do something, I would get really angry. And I just couldn't understand. But I finally realized, because I felt helpless. And the day that I realized this, I was taken back into that place of helplessness. And I realized that, oh my goodness, this is what happens to me when I feel helpless. This was my defense mechanism. This was my fight or flight. I didn't fly. I didn't, escape. I fought, and my fighting came through. It was, the only thing I could describe it as was just ungodly anger. It was rage, and that's how it would come out. I would fight a lot, but a lot of my fights were like defending others. But I just never liked to see people taken advantage of. So what I do these days, I started Break the Silence Global in 2018, and Break the Silence is a nonprofit organization, and it started out as just a conference. It started out as a conference to give women survivors of childhood sexual abuse a place to talk about their story without being re-traumatized. And within 3 months or so, within 5 months, we held 3 conferences, and I saw the effects. I saw women get up and talk about the trauma that they went through. Women who never went into therapy, who never had therapy for it, who never really realized that the trauma that was inflicted upon them as children, that it was affecting their behaviors. And so so deep, and it goes so far. And what I do, I teach about the very thing Hanif was talking about the brain development, about the developmental disorders that comes with trauma. I teach people about how trauma affects the brain and how it can cause us to have adult onset diseases, and how it affects relationships, and just how it affects you overall. One of the things that I do on my 9 to 5, I work with families. And so when I go into these homes to counsel, the very first thing I ask the parents are, what is your childhood trauma? What is your childhood trauma? And there is a lot. And 99.9% of my clients can say, I had sexual abuse, or I had physical abuse, or neglect, or something. But it is there, and it is evident. It is evident in our behaviors. And until we are dealt with from a trauma-informed care level, we are not going to be able to heal, and we are not going to be able to move forward as productive citizens. So I just really am here today to give my story and to give my experience about how this affected me. Today, thank God, I no longer have the anger. I no longer have the rage, because I was able to connect the helplessness and the display of anger. I'm no longer helpless. I'm no longer that helpless little girl, the 8-year-old that was being molested by the babysitter's son. I'm no longer that helpless 10-year-old. And so when I was able to connect that in my brain, my behaviors changed, and it can happen. And so I thank God for where I have come, because my realization just occurred 4 years ago. 4 years ago, and my trauma was from 43 plus years ago. So it is a lifetime, and it takes a lifetime to correct. And I still, it's a process. It's a daily process. Sometimes I have to process things in my head before I speak. Sometimes I have to stop, and if a situation occurs, I have to say, Sandra, you're not helpless. You're no longer helpless. You are not being harmed. You can't be harmed right now. So I sometimes have to talk myself into, not getting into that rage. But it's been a journey. It's been painful emotionally, but I thank God for where I am. So parents, be mindful. Educators, be mindful of the children in your classroom, because that child that you think is a bad child can very well be a traumatized child. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Making that connection between trauma and behavior certainly is very important. It's also really great to create a platform or a space, which you have done, where women feel safe and where they're able to share their stories towards their healing. Thank you so much for that. And again, we are hoping we can engage you more when we get to the Q&A section towards the end of this session. So we're going to move right along now, and we will invite Dr. Shelley, who will be presenting on gender differentials in the experience of children and childhood trauma. Dr. Shelley, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tahira. Good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I'm very humbled to be a part of this panel and this event, and especially to follow Sandra's presentation with you. So I would like to pick up a little bit on what Sandra has shared with us in terms of this linkage between childhood experiences of violence and adult experiences of violence, in particular looking at the intersections between violence against women and violence against children, and what can we do about ways that they overlap, and how can we prevent and respond to both of these forms of violence across the Caribbean. I'll start with sharing that based on global and as well as a regional study that was done, including Caribbean data, there are 6 areas in which violence against women and violence against children overlap. And these areas of overlap include things like shared risk factors, shared norms. So what we think about women, what we think about girls, what we think about children and their role and their place in society and in families, these norms that drive and naturalize violence are shared between the 2 forms of violence. The fact that violence is intergenerational, exactly this question, Sandra, that you put that you're putting towards the women that you work with in terms of what is your childhood trauma. It's very important for us to recognize that violence passes from one generation to the next, and that means also that we have an opportunity to break and interrupt that intergenerational transfer and cycle of violence. There are common consequences, both short and long-term consequences of both violence against women and violence against children, that give us an opportunity to work together. And I want to take a little moment to talk about 2 other areas of overlap that are very important. One is a question of coexistence or co-occurrence, which means that in the countries where we have the comparable data to look at where violence against women and where violence against children is happening, we know that if violence against women is happening in a household or in a family, the children in that household and family are also experiencing violence. And this means that if we're going in with services, if we're trying to prevent all forms of violence, we need to make sure that we address all survivors in that household and not just one based on the services we may be providing. Another important overlap is the age range of adolescence. And adolescence is a period of both opportunity as well as it is a period of increased risk. It is an increased risk for certain forms of violence, for sexual violence. It's an increased risk for perpetuating violence for the first time. But it is also an opportunity. It's a time of life where the brain is still developing, where agency, challenging norms, is a part of the adolescent experience. And so it's also an opportunity for us to engage with adolescent girls and boys around preventing violence and ensuring that violence is not considered a rite of passage, that it's natural, and that intimate relationships must be violent in order for them to be considered relationships based on love. I think that these 6 areas bring us to joint points of action. It's like a call to action for us to join forces, whether we are working on the prevention and response of violence against women, or we are working in the prevention and response of violence against children. And joining forces is important, not only because of this issue of co-occurrence that I mentioned, not only because of the lifelong consequences that violence has when it happens in early childhood, but also because it appears sometimes as if we have 2 parallel boats working on violence against women in one boat and violence against children in another boat. And when violence against women's services, for example, are not considering the experience of adolescent girls with respect to intimate partner violence, adolescent girls they fall through the gaps. They're falling off of one of the boats. Violence against children services don't always consider gendered forms of violence, such as intimate partner violence, or the particular kinds of violence that adolescents may be experiencing. And so it's important to join our forces between different service providers and decision makers so that we ensure that both forms of violence are getting the due attention that they need and survivors are getting the services that they deserve. Some of the key data that was found in these six areas of intersection, I want to share some of them with you and then go on to the areas of action. And some of this picks up also on what Sandra has shared with us. First, mothers and fathers are more likely to physically punish their children if they were physically punished in their own childhood. Second, violence is not experienced in isolation. And we heard Sandra speak about different forms of violence and different causes, perhaps, of violence. These different forms and causes of violence have different consequences, in particular for adolescent girls that we see across the region, whether it's in terms of early pregnancy or early unions or forced marriage. In a broader study that we did around sexual violence in particular, we found that 80% of all acts of sexual violence are committed against adolescent girls. 90% of those cases are repeated rape. We don't always have age-appropriate services, however, for adolescent girls and younger girls who have experienced sexual violence. Social and gender norms, that is one of those shared overlaps between the 2 forms of violence, make corporal punishment acceptable. They render incest and childhood sexual abuse family secrets, and partner violence becomes a rite of passage for adolescent girls and women to bear in silence. As I mentioned, adolescence is a time of both opportunity and increased vulnerability. And finally, women who experienced violence in their childhood are more likely to experience partner violence in their adult intimate relationships. If we look at some of these aspects, and hopefully you'll get a copy of the slides that has the link to the study on it that you can take a look at if you're interested for more details on the data. I wanted to now end with some of the areas for a joint call to action, for us to work on both prevention and response services that address both violence against women and violence against children. The first area for action is to collectively, and we all need to be part of this long-term strategy around transforming harmful gender and social norms. We need to have societies that reject violence as normal, acceptable, or justifiable in family relationships, intimate partnerships, and this needs to happen within families, households, communities, services, and within policy frameworks. We need to also believe and support survivors as part of our path to transform harmful gender and social norms. We also need to harmonize and align laws, policies, and service frameworks on violence against women and violence against children. Basically, we need to ensure that violence against women strategies have age-specific intergenerational approaches, and that violence against children strategies have gender-specific and intergenerational approaches. We need to break the cycle of gender inequalities and violence from early childhood through promoting safe family environments where there's no violence against women, there's no violence against children, those safe family environments that promote gender equality and male co-responsibility in parenting practices. We need to equip school systems and education actors to address violence. We need teachers to have the right training and support to receive disclosures of violence, to have the tools necessary for safe referrals, and to be able to address violence, bullying, cyber violence in teaching practices and in the curriculum. We need to provide age-appropriate information on where and how to seek help that takes ethnic and linguistic diversity into consideration. And this information needs to be where women, girls, boys, and adolescents can see, read, and understand them. We need to reduce the stigma and re-victimization in service provision through a stronger workforce of frontline workers that can address both forms of violence and not only the survivor that is in front of them, thinking again about the issue of co-occurrence. And finally, we need to improve data and evidence on both forms of violence. We need to be able to disaggregate information not only by sex and age, but also by ethnic diversity, by linguistic diversity, and by gender diversity. In particular, there is a gap. There's a statistical silence on girls and boys aged 10 to 14 that we also really need to fill in order to inform our responses. With that, I would like to end. Thank you very much for listening to me. I hope that we can all find ways to address both forms of violence together in responsible and safe ways for survivors. And this, I'm convinced, will help us to break the cycle of violence and trauma. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Shelley. It certainly hit home in a number of areas for me, but mainly the fact violence is learned and it's intergenerational. Many times we do what our parents did without seeking to change patterns because we figure we turned out okay. What was good enough for us through our parents should be okay for our children. But no, you definitely provided a lot of practical and actionable initiatives that can help with this. Thank you for that. So we are going to make way now and invite Shannon Miller-Cox to share with us her presentation. Shannon, over to you.
Thank you. It's a humble honor to be here with you today. I am also a survivor of sexual violence in my childhood and adulthood, and became a law enforcement officer in the United States to protect myself and to arrest people that were harming others. And what I found were thousands and thousands of addicted, abused adults in the criminal justice system that is not prepared to heal harmed brains and harmed limbic systems. And so we started creating spaces for trauma responsive services for women coming out of prison and jail and off the streets, addicted, self-medicating in very dangerous spaces. Women and girls are bought and sold in those spaces. In fact, sex trafficking has beaten out drugs and firearms now internationally and financially. And so we know that we can change this tide. I'm here to bring some great news. We can heal from trauma. We used to call it a disorder, and we used to think that that you would suffer forever, but we have brand new information. Just like a cut on our arm can heal, our brain can heal. It's more of an injury than a disorder, and there are hundreds of and even thousands of psychiatrists trying to get it changed. The labeling of post-traumatic stress disorder to a post-traumatic brain injury, because the brain can heal. So that we don't have to live our lives and suffer forever. The sooner we see a child with trauma, the sooner we can start healing modalities and heal the brain and calm the limbic system. And it changes educational outcomes for children. When we are in fight, flight, and freeze because we live in a dangerous home, we live in a dangerous environment, and we get safe, and we're now emotionally and physically safe in that environment, our brain can start to calm down. And there are all these healing modalities that we can use to rewire our brain for health, to calm the limbic system down so that we can start using the front of our brain to learn again. Sometimes, well, what we know right now is that possibly upwards of half of the children that are diagnosed with ADD and ADHD in the classroom, if you ask them the questions about trauma, they actually have trauma. They actually have a post-traumatic brain injury, which is why they can't focus in a classroom setting. But oftentimes you'll see them start to get medicated for the ADD, ADHD symptoms. What we're teaching those children to do is to self-medicate trauma with amphetamines, which is what they use commonly for ADD and ADHD treatment. So we find adults that start off abusing ADD and ADHD medications in their childhood, abusing them as adults in the form of methamphetamines. But we can change this whole tide. We don't have to wait for people to suffer in addiction and incarceration and in marginality and in poverty to help them start to heal. We can change our classrooms to be trauma informed and trauma responsive. We can have trauma informed and responsive medical settings and pediatric settings and emergency settings. We can change all of the spaces where harmed children show up. Our detention spaces, instead of discipline, we can begin to heal. Classrooms, instead of discipline, we can begin to heal children's brains, calm their limbic system so that they can use the front of their brains again. This takes what? A collective harmony of us all singing the same song. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We're all experiencing trauma. Everyone on this earth is experiencing trauma. We're all afraid. We're afraid of our own deaths, of our children's deaths. We have buried family members and friends. We have suffered. We have all experienced trauma. It needs to become a universal precaution. You remember when the AIDS and HIV epidemic hit the world, we immediately said, bloodborne pathogens, 1 part bleach, 9 parts water. If it's wet and it's not yours, don't touch it. Spray, spray, spray. We now need to say we have a universal precaution. Everyone has trauma. Just assume that everyone has trauma. We need this much trauma intelligence and 9 parts empathy to really try to understand what people and children have suffered through so we can allow them to heal. Spray, spray, spray. We can change the outcomes for harmed children in our classrooms and in our communities. We can heal families. We can heal communities. We can heal entire continents of people. They don't have to suffer. We don't have to throw people away because they're mentally ill because of trauma, because the brain can heal. That is the good news that we bring to you today. With healed families comes family civility, leadership from within the family to change communities and environments. And I'm going to bring God into this conversation because God created all of us with that cellular stuff, right? He created all of us to heal, not some of us, not the wealthy ones, not just the ones with access. He created all of us to heal and be healthy on this earth. There's a reason for each one of us on this earth. And to find that, we all need healing. Tahira?
Thank you so much, Shannon. And that is definitely an important message to know that there is a way through this, that there is a way to recover from your trauma and move on with your life. Thank you for sharing. Now, I've just noticed a message in the chat that says that His Royal Highness, Dr. Rivers, has had to leave. Is this correct, Shannon? And that you will be filling in for him?
Yes.
Okay.
So His Royal Highness Sir Clyde Rivers was going to talk about family civility and how that can change really nations.
Yes.
The core unit of any community is the family. And so you can create all kinds of healing settings for children, but if you don't heal the entire family unit, the child will still go back to a disruptive setting where people are suffering and maybe not parenting through the lens of suffering and past abuse themselves. And so everyone needs to have the ability to heal. Everyone needs the information, right? We have all experienced trauma in our lives. How do we not lay that burden onto our children and the next generation and the next generation? What are the things that we can heal in our families and our communities and in our schools and in our countries? This can be brought about through a collective reckoning, right? A collective transformation where we all get on board with evidence-based practices around brain development, brain healing, limbic system healing, best practices in school settings, healing versus discipline, therapists versus cops, so that we don't criminalize the behavior of trauma. We're used to criminalizing that behavior. For little boys, it can look like aggression. And for some little girls like myself and Sandra, it can look like aggression. So instead of criminalizing that aggression, we have to ask the right questions. We have to say, what's happening to you? And they have to trust us enough to answer that question. It probably can't be a stranger, but a teacher, someone that spends 7-8 hours a day with your child is like an extra parent. They're probably the one that can ask the question. So we can create these safe healing settings for children, but we also have to heal the family unit, because the brain of the child will not heal if they have to go back to a dangerous environment in their home. So the healing starts on an individual level, on a family level, on a community level, and really on a country level. We all have to come together speaking the same language about trauma-informed approaches, trauma responsive, how to heal the brain, where are the spaces that harm children and adults show up, how do we make them feel safe emotionally and physically so that they can start the process of healing and putting their lives back together and don't have to wait 20, 30, 40 years, or come out of incarceration settings like the women I work with walking out of our prisons that have adverse childhood experiences, like 5 to a 10, 10 being the highest that you can have. These women have suffered and suffered and suffered and became addicted. And in addiction spaces, women are bought and sold. Women and children are bought and sold in those spaces and exploited in their spaces. There's more abuse, there's more self-medicating with alcohol and illegal drugs. And then comes the criminal justice system, which is not a space for people to heal from trauma. So we can circumvent all of these pathways right now, this trauma to prison pathway, this trauma to addiction, trauma to early death. None of that has to occur. People can heal, communities can heal, families can heal. We bring a message of hope and healing.
Thank you, Shannon. I certainly agree. This is an issue that it has to be all hands on deck. It has to be comprehensive in its approach. And I think with that, you're leading us perfectly into the question and answer segment, because we actually have some questions coming in, and some of them are leading right into exactly what you were just speaking about. So this first one, there are a number of questions in this post, but I'm going to get through them, and then as a panel, you can decide how you would like to respond. So the first question is from Nicole Cole, and she is asking, how can child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome be addressed clinically? She says, this growing phenomena continues to violate children's human rights. Why is it that when children tell most adults they do not believe them? Who can children trust if when they tell, nothing is done to stop the heinous sexual molestation? So I hand it over to you, panel, if you have any feedback on these questions.
Since I'm already here and was a law enforcement officer, I would say we have to start by believing. Everyone has to be believed. And you can't just be trauma informed in the way that you respond. You have to be responsive. What do you do to immediately protect the child? What are the rules and roles of your community government, the family? What are your responsibilities as a practitioner? In the United States, we have a duty to report child abuse, no matter where we are when we hear it. And so what are the duties and responsibilities of teachers and therapists and medical professionals to protect the child first? Believe the child first, protect the child second.
Agreed. I think it all comes back to trust, you know, the journey for the child to come forward and say that this has happened to them would have already been difficult. So then to be met with someone who is telling you that they possibly even just an inclination that they don't believe you is off-putting already. So definitely that trust and that feeling of safety, that is very important. Another question that we have coming from our viewers is, how do parents help adolescents to overcome their anger? And Sandra, this one might be for you. You spoke quite a bit to that in your presentation.
One of the first things is to find out what is causing that anger. Anger is a natural emotion, it is. But what I found out, like in my case, there are so many emotions that are beneath the surface that we don't even identify. We don't even know how to identify them. Anger is the one that is most familiar to everyone and seems to be more acceptable. So most of the time children don't know. So you have to find out. One of the things I've always told my parents is this: if you see a change in your child's behavior, question it. If you had an outgoing child and all of a sudden your child has become withdrawn and angry, right? And disrespectful, so to speak, as they would say, a little bit defiant, you need to begin to ask questions, right? If your child has now started smoking and you had a child who never used to smoke before, begin to ask questions. And Shannon said it, and you also said it. Children are not going to tell unless they're comfortable, they can trust you. So if a child is showing anger and they don't feel like they can trust their parent, they're not going to tell the parent. They're not going to tell the parent anything. So I would suggest get that child into some form of therapy. Get that, or find someone. It's a village. It should be a village. Just find someone that child is comfortable with so that child can say, this is what's going on, right? And a lot of times when we see our children angry, we tend to think that they have an attitude or something. We have to begin to change our lenses and begin to realize that it can be so much more. So we need to ask questions. The parents need to sit that child down and ask questions. What's going on with you? Is something wrong? Talk to me. If you don't feel like talking to me, who do you feel like you're comfortable talking with? We need to begin to have conversations with our children.
Agreed. Thank you, Sandra. Just leveling with your child and knowing your child as well, so that you're able to see these signs of changes and know that something is wrong. And again, yes, just like you're saying, speaking to the child, letting them know, okay, I realize something is wrong. If you're not comfortable speaking to me, let's find someone that you can speak to. It could be a family member, it could be a family friend, someone that can help. I noticed that Hanif has his hand raised. Hanif, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I wanted to jump in the conversation. In addition to what both Shannon and Sandra spoke about, I want to go before we get to that juncture. What I think is missing in the Caribbean context is creating a non-punitive, safe space for children to be able to express themselves. That is why children lie in the first key instance, and that is why children speak to people who are non-trusting adults in most cases, because we are not creating a safe space in our homes. It is always punitive. We have almost criminalized every behavior of the child. So the child is always afraid to come forward. So before we even get to go into the professional and all of that, when we recognize, if we begin to create a home where parents can ensure that the child feels safe enough to come to them and have this conversation, so that when they do feel as if there is need to, they can easily say, Mom, Dad, Grandma, Uncle, this is what's going on. So my advice is, in addition to what was said, let us help our parents, our schools, our teachers, our community develop safe, non-punitive spaces for children to be able to have this conversation. I am saying to schools as well, we need to create an environment where you have conversation with young people. That is not math and English, but it is about human life and human development, and to listen to children so that we are able to put things in place. I call it being proactive.
Yeah.
Thank
May I
you,
jump in? Can I
Yes,
add to it?
of course.
I love Anif. Like Anif has become like my new muse here. I can attest to that because before I was molested, I was always told no one should touch you, right? No one should touch you. And so when I was molested and when I was raped, my rapist actually told me no one is going to believe you. So I didn't tell, right? Because I was told no one should touch you. So I felt like, okay, I'm being violated, but I may get in trouble. So I never told. I told no one until I blocked it out. I remembered when I was 19, even when my mother asked me when I was in my 30s, early 30s, I told her no. I told her no, and I did not disclose until like 5 years later. I was like 37 years old when I disclosed fully, because that same thing of, thinking I was going to get in trouble when I knew I didn't do anything wrong. So yeah.
You both raised very important points, and the need to empower our children so that they know that their voices are important. Forget about this old adage with children should be seen and not heard. No, children should be heard, and they should be empowered to use their voices and speak up. And then we as adults listen to them. So it really is a mind shift. It's different from the way that we may have been brought up, but definitely important in moving forward. Thank you both for sharing. We have another question, and we're going to move through them because we are getting towards the end of our session. We're in our last 10 minutes. So let's see how much of your knowledge we can get to share with our viewers. So one question is, since the onset of the pandemic, there have been increased reports of domestic violence. This will also have an impact on the children in the home, whether directly or indirectly. So what advice can you give in this regard? This is very topical, very now. The panel?
I could start the conversation there. And I'm going to start by saying school for children, work for adults. Why do I say that? For many of us, our children was escaping the brutality of home by going to school and staying as long as they can in school. And for the adults, they escape the brutality of their partner by going to work and staying as long as they can at work. What the pandemic did, it removed that safety net to some degree. And so what happened is our children are now living 24 hours in, and the abuser and the abusee are now living 24 hours in. So there's no break. And as a clinician, I have seen over the last year and a half a serious increase in children as well as couples and or individual parts of a couple coming for therapy. Because now that those hairline fractures, because of the proximity of space and time, created an avalanche now. And so it is full on drama. And our children have not been escaping from that unscathed. And so the level of abuse continues to be rampant throughout the homes. Even domestic violence is on the rise because, again, we are not putting the parameters in place to help people in the home. I keep making the point that while I understand the pandemic is a medical crisis, equally important is a psychological, mental health, and trauma crisis that we have to go into our homes and help people treat with those as well. I give way.
Okay, I see that. Sorry. Okay, so lots of input on this. Shelley has her hand raised, and Sandra would also like to give some input. So you can go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, just very quickly to add on to Hannah's reflection, I think, on the one hand, it's very sad that the pandemic has showed us that school is a safe haven and homes are not for children. Homes and families are not. And I think, what we've learned through this pandemic is that services that do not have remote capacity or not having the ability to use a call center because you can't find a safe place in your home to be able to call means we need more innovative ways, but also community-based ways. What are our neighborhood systems in order to be able to detect when a child or a woman is asking for help in a situation of lockdown? Because we've learned we're not always going to be able to get the services out there or have them be able to reach the services to ask for help, if not through other symbols. I mean, we've seen examples of pictures in windows, hand symbols. We've seen lots of ways that women and children have had to ask for help, and we need to continue to invest in community networks that can also be there to help respond. Thank you.
So my 9 to 5, I am actually an in-home counselor. That's what we do. And our clients come to us through, I live in Florida. Our clients come through us through Department of Children and Families. And it is really interesting to see when you go into the homes, it's total chaos. It is total chaos. But one of the great things about going into the homes is that I'm able to get in and I'm able to assess the environment that these children and these women live in. By the time they come to my organization, sometimes the male is still in the home. Sometimes the perpetrator is still in the home, right? And sometimes he's not. But what I found out even lately is that sometimes the females are so overwhelmed, they don't even want to accept the services because it's like a cycle and the cycle goes on and on. And it's as if they feel like they can't get away from the perpetrator. So it's like sometimes they don't even want to accept the services. But being able to get into the home and work with them, when we're able to get in and to work with them, miracles can happen, you know. And like Shannon said earlier, and I've always been a big believer, you cannot help a child unless you change the environment. And when we are able to go in and help to change the environment, help to change the toxicity, help to identify the childhood trauma and everything, it makes a huge difference.
Thank you so much, Sandra. This is such a topical moment. This is such important information that you're sharing. And I really wish that we had more time because we have some more questions coming in from our viewers. It's very interesting. I feel like we're just getting warmed up, but unfortunately we must wrap up now because we do have another session coming up right after this at 5 o'clock. And we encourage all of our viewers to please tune into that as well. We will be announcing the winner of the Island Ideas Challenge coming up right after this. But panel, before we close out, I'm going to give you an opportunity to share any last thoughts that you may like to share before we wrap up today's session.
And so for me, I want to thank OECS for allowing me but a short space in this very critical conversation. I'm hoping that it's something that we can continue. Again, child trauma is critical, but equally critical is how we treat with it, not just in a one-time space, but over the lifetime. And I'm hoping that we can change our approach, our practice model to help children to truly get out of this scourge of trauma. I thank you. God bless everyone.
I would also like to thank you guys for allowing me this opportunity to come and to share my experience, to share my story. It is very humbling, and thank you. It's a pleasure being on this platform with so many esteemed professionals. So I would just love to thank you for the opportunity. God bless.
I would also like to thank OECS for the opportunity and the panel. And I think my last kind of message that I'd like to throw out there is that it's going to take all of us to change beliefs and to change norms, that violence is okay, that it's not a big deal, that you have to keep it quiet. It's not okay. It is not my birthright. It's not your birthright. It can be prevented and we can do it, but only if we do it together.
And I just hope that everyone has a sense of hope that healing is possible and that we can heal children, we can heal families, and we can heal communities. And having these conversations is challenging and can be a little uncomfortable, but it's worth it. These conversations are worth it. Everyone deserves the ability to heal.
Healing is possible, the perfect message to end today's session. Thank you so much to our esteemed panel for your time and sharing your knowledge with us. And thank you to our viewers for tuning in and participating.